Hello, and thanks for joining us this evening. We hope you've had a good bank holiday weekend. I'm Kaia Charles from Now Gallery, and welcome to the very final talk in our color series, Illuminating Color. This evening, we're going to delve into the artist practice of Liz West, and we've had the pleasure of working with Liz to develop a very significant public artwork for the Tide, and it's now been installed. And we'll come back to that. But the Tide was designed by DSNR, completed in 2019, and we have a fantastic public realm artwork now. Before we start, I really want to encourage you to submit questions to Liz using the Q&A function. And we'll ask those questions at the end of the session. Our team will be sharing related links to the discussion, so keep an eye on the chat for those. And just a little bit about Liz. She's a British artist who graduated from the Glasgow School of Art in 2007. Her work encompasses site-specific installations, sculpture, and wall-based artworks. And Liz, you create vivid environments that mix luminous color and radiant light. And you want to provoke a heightened sensory awareness in the viewer. So welcome, Liz. I wanted to start by asking you about the very early points in your practice and perhaps even moments in your childhood that might have influenced your approach to color.
There's so much to say about my influences and color and light, but hello everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you for having me, Now Gallery. What a privilege to be asked. It's great to be speaking to you from my studio, my home, in fact. So yes, welcome to my home. Where did I start? Well, I've tried many times to pinpoint this myself. And I think, you know, for me, it was a very natural path to kind of go through art education. And even when I was going through art education, I was thinking, well, how did I get here? And I do put it all down to my parents, who were both and are both artists. You know, so I grew up in a really creative environment with art being made and art being displayed, and curators like yourself, Kaia, being invited around for meals and dinner parties.
We've actually got some images of your very kind of early work from Glasgow.
Yeah, so yeah, going through art education, my first 2 years at Glasgow were awful. But Glasgow was definitely the right place for me, and I was obsessed with the idea of maybe going to London to do my education. You know, I was really obsessed with going to Goldsmiths, I remember, because at the time I remember mum and dad having books on the YBAs and seeing exhibitions like Sensations and thinking, oh yeah, that's what I want to do. And then it didn't work out. I didn't get into Goldsmiths. But I did get into Glasgow and a few other places, and my dad said, right, if you want to go to Glasgow, you better get in the car and we'll go to Scotland. I'd never been to Scotland. But we arrived in Glasgow on what seemed like an unusual sunny day, and I fell in love with it. I could imagine myself living in the tenement houses and the kind of grey, gritty northernness of it, you know, having lived in Barnsley and since having moved to Manchester. Yeah. It just appealed to me. I liked how small it was, and that the art school itself was right in the middle of the city, and it was the sculpture and environmental art course that I was on was based just around the corner from the Charles Rennie Mackintosh building. So it was in an old disused children's hospital. So unlike the Mac, which was pristine and you couldn't touch it and all the painters were in there, the Barnes building, you could make interventions in the spaces and you basically rip it to pieces, and nobody batted an eye, which was great. And one thing that I loved doing was taking the bookable spaces in time. And I think this is what this drawing was for. You know, I used to just sit in those spaces. It's literally...
I was overwhelmed by Glasgow. We went to the Glasgow International Festival, and you just get a really really great sense of the, you know, how art can inhabit some of those industrial spaces.
Well, yeah, it definitely struck a chord with me. And I think what the course was good for me was that it kind of, instead of just making art in your studio space and then transplanting it onto a gallery wall, the whole kind of teaching was to look at spaces differently and how you might respond to that space. What does that space need? How can you change the perception of that space? And that was both done in the sculpture department, which I was in, and the environmental art department, which was kind of next door, but I was friends with all the students, and they did it more in the public realm. So this work, I'd very quick story, which is illuminating, no pun intended. So I was making what I think was awful work, kind of based on the briefs they set. And then when I went into my final year and the term gearing up to the degree show, so the final term, my tutor, Tanya, took me to one side and she was like, you know, I've been watching you. Oh God. And she said, you know, I realised you're a very sensual person. What does that mean? How do I unpick that? And she basically said, oh, you're very in touch with your senses. Everything around you is heightened. Why don't you think about that instead of making work about other things you thought you were interested in, which we'll come on to in a bit. And so at that point, another tutor said, well, instead of making these paintings using vivid colour, a bit like Ian Davenport's, where I was dripping kind of paint down surfaces, he said, well, why don't you film the painting and then project it back into the space? And it was then when I projected the coloured light that I realised that it was additive mixing that appealed to me rather than subjective mixing, which is pigment.
You might need to unpick some of those terms a little bit more. Additive mixing.
Okay. Yeah. It's when all colours come together in light to make white light.
Awesome.
Subjective mixing, all colours in pigment coming together to make a muddy, browny, grey mess. It's just mixing colours, either by using light or pigment. And I've explored both in the last 10 years. They're really exciting things to unpick. Anyway, so I very quickly moved on to this piece, which is my degree show. And there's my mum pressing her face up to the degree show piece, which was called Yellow Chamber. And it was like this light track corridor that you walked into, and these beams, these really strong, intense beams of yellow light struck you as you walked in, kind of lured you in, pulled you into this corridor, which was completely pristine and white. And I'd crafted every single element of this space within the Macintosh building in Studio 19, where 7 years later, that exact room was where the fire started.
Yeah,
so that's quite a weird tie for me, because I know what that space was like, very dark. So there's lots of mezzanines in this studio, and under this mezzanine I'd been given to create this kind of blackout space. Anyway, this yellow light beckoned you. You press your face against this aperture that I'd made in the wall, and beyond that was a mirrored space, deceptively small, which looked infinite, with a collection of purely coloured yellow objects lying on the floor.
And this speaks to this idea of objects and collecting, you know, that we will explore. I think a lot of people don't realize that you actually hold an extraordinary collection. And we were really tickled by this, but do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Oh, you've done the reveal too soon. Well, yes. So yeah, I thought I was interested in collections of objects at this point, because I had the most massive collection of Spice Girls memorabilia, which I began amassing when I was 11 years old. So that would have been 1996, and let's face it, who wasn't a fan of that girl band in the late 90s? Well, certainly as a preteen, I was obsessed. And what really appealed to me was how they were all individual. They all were very vibrantly coloured. Just that 90s aesthetic really struck a chord with me. The kind of pop, the kind of kitsch in a way. My dad,
hyper visual sensibility.
Yeah, and my dad was a record collector, so amassing things was familiar to me. And so when I went to the shops I just started collecting the stuff, and I would keep it in the packaging as an 11-year-old, and all my friends would be, you know, tearing the pencil cases open and using them, wearing the backpacks, t-shirts, and I'd be just keeping them. And my kind of way of playing was maybe arranging them on the shelves in my bedroom, taking them down, photographing them in situ, and then putting them back. So when I went to Glasgow, I discovered eBay, equipped with my student loan, and not a huge love of my halls of residence, which I found quite depressing. I'd spend all the evenings in the library just bidding on eBay of this memorabilia. It would all get posted to my mum and dad's house, who were now on first name terms with the postman. And I quickly discovered you could buy the costumes, the boots, the award discs, stuff that I would never have imagined having as a child. And of course, I was never going to meet them living in Barnsley, was I? So, you know, to have this stuff made me feel closer to my idols. Mm-hmm. And then when I did a placement at Paisley Art Museum and Gallery in my third and final year, I couldn't help but share that I'd got this collection. And she said, the curator said, well, why don't you explore the potential of hiring this collection out to museums when you graduate? Which I did. And I would take a higher fee for it, and I would curate it, and I'd, you know, have the knowledge to write the kind of information panels. And I did that for a while and made enough money to kind of sustain my practice as a full-time artist.
And I guess that being self-funded allowed you to be quite experimental. And I guess it would be good to look at how your studio practice has evolved. You know, how you explored kind of vivid artificial light in contrast to what you in your words, are unplugged works. Mm-hmm. So I know you've got a series of works you want to take us through, but yeah, we're starting here with Vanishing Boundaries.
Yeah, this was one of what I call humanly scaled works. So this was before I moved on to the more monumental scale pieces and public artworks that I've become known for. And that doesn't mean to say that I don't love this piece, and I'd like to revisit it at this scale. It was intimate, and I love that. Vanishing Boundaries was made in an abandoned or not yet hired space in central Manchester. By this point, I've moved to Manchester and begun at first showing my degree show work again, and having the opportunity to remake my chambers in all different colours and shapes and forms. And then I managed to get some Arts Council England funding for research and development. And that £10,000 basically was a self-funded MA. Because at this point I hadn't done an MA, and it was at this point that I was thinking, should I do one? Where should I do one? I don't want to go back to Glasgow. I can't afford to move to London. I'm now in Manchester. What do I do? And that money, you know, afforded me materials, it afforded me advice, and space. There was an abundance of space available in the city at this time to take for free and make work in. So I loved the kind of concrete, industrial, glass. The materials in the space were really interesting to respond to with artificial light and mirrors. And I suppose what the mirrors and the light do is both illuminate and reflect the space even more. So it's exaggerating the space. And when you see this work, yourself as a viewer are reflected in the mirrors in situ. So you become very aware of yourself looking at the work in the space you are. It's very grounding. But you start noticing elements of the space that you might not normally see, like the elements of the ceiling. And I think what's really important, that runs all the way through my practice, is illuminating, what either through artificial light or natural light, illuminating parts of space that literally make you do this and look and see. And I think people just don't see, because everyone's just kind of in their little bubbles on the phones. I think we've stopped looking.
And it's quite a kind of harmonious quality of light that's being created here. The kind of pools. Okay, India, can we move on? Thank you. So this is your color perception in 2015. I think this is extraordinary. This is one of my favorite works. I haven't seen it in real life, but the images are extraordinary, and I can only imagine what it was like to be immersed in such kind of, you know, enveloping light.
It was a good one. I love it. I love it too. I mean, what happened in that 2 years between making the previous work and this work was that I had a complete crisis and meltdown and artist block, and I just didn't know how to move forward from that. I didn't know what to do, and I went on a self-initiated residency at the Mertz Barn in Cumbria, and I went up with my best friend, and we kind of sat together for a week or so in this very cold barn, and I just thought, what do I do next? And I read, and someone suggested that I write on the walls, like, why colour? Why light? Why am I an artist? And over the duration of the residency, I kind of added bits to it. And then at the end, I had a critique of what I'd written and why. And it was so important to do that, because it was from that in the October 2014 that all this that I'm in now has happened. And I kind of answered all the questions, and I kind of came into 2015 knowing exactly why I make the work I do, what my voice is as an artist, who I am, why I'm an artist. All the answers were shaped from that residency. And Your Colour Perception was me making work that I was in love with. The first piece that I was like truly in love with. And it was in a massive space in Manchester called Federation House. It's 8 floors. It was the ex-co-op headquarters. They'd just moved to a really new building around the corner. And this space was being let and managed by Castlefield Gallery, who had given my husband, Mark Devereaux, one of the floors for his artist to work with. He represents several artists. So I'd spent a lot of time on that floor. And I want to do something in this space, but I don't know what. And this space was kind of on the floor above, and you could kind of hire it for, I think it was £60 a week. So I said, right, okay, I'll have it for a week, and I'll have it the last week of January 2015. I didn't know what I was going to do. Right through Christmas, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I remember thinking, was I going to put LEDs down the columns? I just had no idea, but it was 10,000 square feet. It's massive. But
you described it as kind of transforming the space into visceral experience.
Yeah.
By overloading it with chromatic light.
I wanted to do so. I wanted to fill it, but I didn't. I really didn't know how to fill it. I keep all my materials and my old things and reuse them, repurpose them. So I had this bag of filters, which I started taping over the lamps in the square grates in the ceiling to much effect. And so that's what I decided to do. Instead of placing squares directly over the square apertures, I had to pull down the kind of metal grids, which are full of about 40 years worth of dust and detritus, wrap it around the lamps themselves. And yeah, there's so much going on in this piece. I mean, I opened it for 2 days only, so Saturday and Sunday, 2 p.m. till 8 p.m. I wanted quite European opening hours. I wanted it to go dark in the time that space was open, so people could see dusk happening. And when that kind of magic hour happened, I wanted the work to extend out of the space and into the night sky. So that blue was a continuum. But then obviously as it darkened, the saturation inside the space got more and more intense.
You really get a sense of depth with this.
Yeah, and the windows were mirrored, so it kind of reflects back on yourself. And yeah, 400 people came, which is quite remarkable in such a short space of time. Yeah. It's like completely self-managed, initiated, and made.
Awesome. And then the next piece is an additive mix. And I think this is beautiful. It really has a kind of painterly quality. And I wanted to kind of ask you if you know, you were surprised by some of the outcomes of the patterns and, you know, how the materials reflected the light, creating these painterly, I feel, qualities.
I mean, when I was at Glasgow, when I had my kind of meltdown before I knew what I wanted to do with light, I did ask to go in the painting department. I was like, should I transfer into painting? And they were like, no, because in sculpture you can do painting, but in all different ways. Definitely had a painter's sensibility, I think, and that came from being completely obsessed with colour as a child, and doing really simple things like mixing PVA glue and pigment together and pouring it on plastic, leaving it to dry, and then peeling it off and sticking it to my windows. And I was doing that at like 7 years old. So that painterly sensibility has kind of always been with me. And this piece was commissioned by the National Media Museum in Bradford in the same year that I've made Your Colour Perception, and this was made like 5 months after. And in fact, I went for my interview for this commission whilst I was installing the previous work you've seen. You know, installing that piece, such a huge scale, and wrapping 1,600 lamps in 5 days by myself was a massive undertaking. I really didn't have the time to go for this interview, but I did, and I'm glad I did. And I remember taking images of my degree show work, which were these mirrored chambers, and then talking about how everybody's comments were that they wanted to be inside these chambers rather than just looking at them through an aperture. And so I thought, well, this seems like the perfect opportunity to do that and create that. And using acrylic mirrors, which have that slight wobble to them, kind of creates this psychedelic, trippy effect. And this room is 10 meters by 5 meters and completely constructed within, it's a space within a space. Mm. And there's 250 different colors, 250 6-foot fluorescent lamps in the ceiling. So it did feel quite warm in that space.
Brilliant. And the next piece is Through number 3, which I think was installed in 2015 and then again in 2020. Mm. And obviously here you now start to contemplate public realm spaces.
Yeah, well, again, this was all in this same year, and it was a bit of a mega year for me, you know, because I discovered who I was as an artist, and this was the first unplugged piece I've made at this point, and it felt like, why am I not harnessing the sunlight? Why this free source of light? Why should I not tap into that? And before that, I'd focused very much on artificial light, and I'd begun to understood it very well, and I'd become a crafter of it. But I thought, well, why can't I manipulate sunlight as well? But the piece was like, how do you get colour into the built environment? And it was commissioned for Spinningfields in Manchester, which is grey, steel, concrete, glass. And it's completely depleted of colour. And I just thought, when I did my site visit, how do I make a public artwork that isn't just something that sits on a plinth and is static? How can I make something that is immersive, that is colour, that is light, that changes the environment, moves? It had to have all these things. So I thought, well, it ends up being a piece of architecture, in effect. It has to be something people can go into. It has to be an environment.
And I should just say, you not only explored, shadow and light explicitly through color. I had a look at one of your pieces, your subjective mix, and I think that was simply kind of pure shadow and light without really having to kind of use the lens of color. So that's quite interesting. How did this piece differ in terms of what, because it's been situated in 2 different places. What did you think that there was a difference in the quality of light, different parts of the UK?
Really interesting question, because when it was commissioned in Manchester, it was commissioned for the winter months, and it went up in November. So, very dark, and it had to come to life in the evening too. So it had to be lit in the evening light, and it did completely different things, equally beautiful. And on the occasional sunny Manchester day, it came to life. And then it's been in Leeds, where I started seeing it in a slightly more open space, which worked, rather than a busy, visually noisy space like Spinningfields. And then when it was installed in Dukey Bjork Square for the Kensington Chelsea Art Weekend, it looked the best it's ever looked. I mean, it had space, it had the summer, October, but we had a really beautiful October. And yes, the quality of light was very different. The colours seemed more saturate and intense.
So our color reflection.
Yeah. Again, it's funny because I made through number 3, which is using the sun. It's unplugged, but this really felt like my first unplugged piece. And I think this is because I'd proposed a piece for the 2021 Visual Arts Centre in Scunthorpe right back in the January 2015. And I remember the curator wanting a piece like Your Colour Perception, you know, illuminating artificial light. And I remember doing a visit to the 2021 Visual Arts Centre, which is a deconsecrated church. And there was no way you could utilise pre-existing luminaires to that effect. So I thought, well, what can I put in this space that feels like it really truly belongs? And so I paid attention to the way the sun moved around the space and came in through the vast church windows, and how if I made something that was to sit on the floor, and it had to sit on the floor because you couldn't screw down into the floor or the walls or the ceiling, had to be completely modular and standalone. What if that surface is mirrored? And so when the light hits it, these orbs of light flash up and hit elements of the architecture and illuminate them. So it was kind of borrowing the palette as well from stained glass windows. So it wasn't my kind of usual intense saturation, which felt quite scary. And it took me, I can't believe I'm saying this, it took me years to like this piece. Honestly, it's really weird. I remember standing in front of it for the first time and going, I'm not sure if I like this. And there's a real element of vulnerability to the work I make, because obviously I can make sketches of it, like drawings, but there's nothing like standing in front of it. It's not like a painter who can walk away from the canvas and go, oh, I think I need to touch that bit up there. I'm seeing it for the first time that you're seeing it as the viewer. So that's worrying sometimes, but I do have a very, very sharp imagination, and I can completely see in my mind's eye what a work is going to look like and how it's going to feel in the space. And this iteration, which is right now in Finland in my solo exhibition in Hyvinkää, I think it looks the best it's ever looked. And I think that's because it's in a really pure space with a lot of white. So I just wish I could go and see it.
And do you have a sense of movement with this as they kind of evolve throughout the day, or lighting conditions change?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when it was up in Scunthorpe and I brought my mum and dad to see it, and my dad was like, it's not really doing what it should do. And it was just it was a June or May overcast day, and it just wasn't doing all the shining up on the light, but it was still magical because, you know, you could still see yourself in the reflections and the architecture in the reflections. And I felt really disappointed for my dad that he saw it in that way. And unfortunately, he had terminal cancer at that point and actually died 3 weeks later. So I knew at the time that it was going to be the last piece of my work he was ever going to see. So I wanted it to be so good. But
well, it is that for sure.
He would like it now in Hyvinkää because it's doing exactly what he expected it to do. But certainly when, you know, the sun disappears behind the clouds, it changes all the time. It's a sundial.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
Unlike this piece, which is not.
So again, you're flooding, an interior space with different shades of light. Is this using fluorescent light again?
This is using the pre-existing fluorescent lamps in the space, yes. So this was made for the Bristol Biennial, and I applied to the Bristol Biennial to remake Your Colour Perception. And they accepted it. And then it was a matter of finding the right space. And so it had to be obviously a large space. It had to ideally have columns running through it because those columns act as surfaces for the light to bounce off. And it had to have multiple hundreds of fluorescent light fittings in the ceiling. So you don't want to start buying in fluorescent lights. The cost would just get astronomical. And when they found this space, you know, we were doing all these site visits via video chat at the time, and this space was fully carpeted with green carpet tiles, which was disgusting.
Oh.
I remember really vividly saying, we can't do that. You're going to have to pull them up. So they started pulling the green carpet tiles, and underneath it was like this sticky glue, obviously. So then they started like trying to rub this glue off with solvent, and it was kind of obviously really like affecting the volunteers and the people working in the offices, like top and bottom.
Wow.
So then they were like, well, we can't do that. What should we do? Flip the metal tiles underneath. And the technicians tried it and they were like, can't do that. So then there was like loads of chats about, well, do we get like a white carpet put down? Do we get like sheets put down? What do we do? And in the end, the techs kind of persisted with the metal tile flipping, and thankfully to great effect.
Yeah, it completely, completes the piece, having that surface.
Yeah, but that was a very kind of last minute addition, let's say.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, we're going to whiz through because I know we still have to talk about the piece on the peninsula. So this piece is Spectral Vision. Was this the Natural History?
Yeah, Natural History commissioned it, and it was the first time I'd used LED. So this is why I wanted to talk about it, because before that I'd always been in love with fluorescent lighting, and that is purely because it's a material, it's glass, it's fragile, it comes in set lengths, and that's it. You've not got too many options to play around with, whereas with LED there's almost too many options to play around with. So I tried to find lamps that looked like fluorescent lamps, which I managed to find. But the reason why they're LEDs and not fluorescent is because the exhibition was about colour and vision. So how we and all different animals and specimens see colour. And so there was taxidermy on the other side of the wall. So it meant that the light had to be completely cold.
Yes, yeah.
So, and this was the first time I used dichroic glass, which is another fab material which I'd wanted to use for years, which I'm a bit obsessed with. I'm obsessed with materials in general and what they do and what they don't do. Now I can push them. So this piece just took the principle, again, all my work is kind of rooted in the principles of light and colour and the theories of both. So this piece kind of took the theory of Isaac Newton, first seeing the spectrum laid out after opening his window and revealing a chink of light, and how that fell onto a prism and illuminated the space. So you can see a little white chink running right through it, and that's little Isaac's chink.
Each piece has, quite a different quality. This is quite soft.
It's not always. I think what's beautiful about dichroic is from one angle it's pastel, and from another angle it's like completely saturated and vivid.
Well, that's how you kind of manipulate the light and using, these fantastic materials. I just want to remind the audience that they can submit questions via the Q&A function, and we'll be putting those questions to Liz shortly. And so this is under Paddington Bridge?
This is under the Westway.
The Westway.
Yeah, and this was the first permanent piece I'd ever made. Through number 3 was temporary, this was permanent. And so, again, really quite gritty, concrete, industrial outlook. What can I do? What can I put into that environment that's going to change that environment? The litmus test for me as a single female walking under the Westways, do I feel safe? And I wanted to make a piece of work that made me feel safe and didn't make me kind of look behind me every 5 seconds. But at the time as well, there was a lot of talk about making something digital. I wasn't the only artist in the conversation about making a piece on this wall. But I kind of argued that our eyes and our bodies through movement are so advanced with technology that by moving across this space and creating a piece that was dynamic, kaleidoscopic, like origami, that it could change depending on how you move back and forth, side to side. And that was all done through our eyes. Why do we need to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on technology and sensors when we do that anyway?
Yeah. And it's contemplating kind of liminal spaces and looking at how, you know, we kind of transition through, which leads us on to the piece that you've done for Greenwich Peninsula, which we're delighted with. And so for those who don't know, the piece is installed on the Tide, which is a series of walkways that connect Peninsula Square on Greenwich Peninsula, if you're coming from North Greenwich, to the river. And we really wanted to make it transitional and have audiences be able to experience art as they transition through. So let's talk a little bit about this. I think personally it looks like a ribbon, kind of undulating ribbon unfurling.
I mean, it was quite daunting going for my first site visit. I remember when I was in London for the London Design Festival, I just made the piece in Fortnum & Mason. So that was September 2019. I met you on the Tide, and I just thought, oh my God, it's huge. And we'd had email conversations at this point about proposing a piece as a kind of winter piece. It was going to initially be in like November through to March, like a winter piece, almost like a Christmas vibe to it, almost. And you'd looked at some of my previous works, like the mirrors in the churches, and we kind of talked about having or adapting a pre-existing work. And when I got there, I just remember thinking, no, we can't, because it would just shrink. Even though these were massive pieces that I'd made, for one, the pieces were all kind of made for indoors, and this was outdoors. And I remember just walking the length of the Tide and looking at the sheer amount of glass surfaces and thinking, well, why can't that be my canvas? Why can't I use, instead of spending money on materials which might be down on the ground that you stand on the Tide and look down on, or structures that are created that you look at, why not just manipulate the architecture anyway? Because it's an astonishing piece of architecture. And I'd started making series drawings about how colours mix and meet, and how that was a metaphor as a meeting point, a physical meeting point for people. And I'd also thought about the location, Greenwich as Greenwich Meridian, so a sundial again, and how I really wanted so many things in this work, how I wanted to get moving. How do you get people to walk from one end to the other and engage with the complete environment? And so this piece is what I proposed, and it's doing what I wanted it to do. The work is a kind of PVC vinyl that's stuck onto the glass. So it's temporary, unfortunately, but it changes all different times of day. Even when it's wet, as you can see in the picture on the left, you get the lovely reflections in the puddles. And like this Easter weekend, the lovely weather we've had, it's been really at its best. And obviously because of COVID restrictions, the piece has been moved. And instead of November, it's just been launched now. And I actually think, in a way, COVID did us a favour, because I think it is
totally the right time, I think, for this piece. Yeah. And we will really get to kind of learn more about this piece, because, you know, it's only just been installed, and we'll have it installed throughout, you know, from spring to summer. How are you hoping that the shadows and the piece will behave as we transition through?
I mean, I think it's having spent time with it myself and just seeing how, even just depending on different times of the day, how the shadows elongate and how different parts of the structure are illuminated depending on what time of the day it is. It's clear that the morning light hits the Thames end and the evening and afternoon light hits the peninsula end. And even just that in itself makes you want to move from A to B and experience both. I'll be really interested to keep coming back and seeing it for myself. And I think hopefully it is a piece people want to return to and see in different lights and different weather conditions. Yeah, it's ever changing. It's a sundial.
And it's amazing how strong, you know, the strength of those shadows. Yeah, it feels like, again, it's painterly, you know, that the floor surfaces have been treated in some way, but those are the actual shadows from the piece. So it's so delightful to see it.
Quite a mission though, wasn't it? I mean, I remember saying to you, Kaia, if we're going to do this, we've got to cover everything.
Just ended up being 700 meters.
Yes.
And I think as lovely as these images are, you really cannot, unless you visit it, you can't understand the true scale of this piece. It's just really fantastic.
And, you know, credit to all the people working on this as well, like especially Scanstick, who printed and stuck all this on, and M3 Industries, Simon, who sat and actually wrote a computer program coding system to generate the coloured shards in a random order, because we felt that we didn't want to humanly place the shards in different lengths and different colours because it would look too contrived. It had to have like this painterly quality which comes from a randomness. So yeah, he spent weeks just leading up to Christmas last year writing a computer program that would spit out these triangles. And then I've got the drawings here. I printed them out and then annotated them all, sent them back, and yeah, it's just a mission, but so worth it.
It was truly a team effort on our end as well. We've got Magda and Shannon and Gary who all kind of worked on this to help this, to make this happen. And we're extending it. Initially it was going to be taken down in May, but we're going to extend it throughout the summer. So please do come down when you can to see that. And we've got some fantastic events. I think we'll end on the events. Actually, we were actually going to ask you to show some of your material studies. I don't know if we still have time to do that really quickly. If that's something you have time to do really quickly.
I do, yeah. I mean, all these drawers behind me.
Your drawings and stuff.
Have all my materials in and drawings and swatches and things. So, you know, I kind of wish you were all here, really. Yeah, I mean, so you've got like the materials for Paddington, which is the kind of aluminium alu panel with a PVC vinyl stuck on, so I can get it all different colours, and you can see through the keyring that the vinyl is kind of stuck on top of the shiny surface to make it look like a green mirror. And I used optically clear vinyl, which is a very fragile, very thin PVC, which has a backing on, and you peel off and adhere to the aluminium. And the reason why we used aluminium, for example, for the Paddington piece was because it's durable for outdoor use rather than glass mirror, which could obviously be damaged quite easily. And then, you know, you've got things like this, which is amazing dichroic plastic, but you can get it in glass as well. And this is what my Fortnum & Mason piece was made of. Again, it's a clear polycarbonate which has a film stuck over it. So
that was absolutely beautiful, that piece. Went to see it.
Did you go?
Yeah.
That's in Finland as well, looking very different, completely reorganized. And then drawings, you know, going back to the piece in the church, let me see. So this would have been one of my drawings for it. So just, you know, I would take the plan of the building itself and then start kind of making drawings on top of the plan. And the same with the Natural History Museum piece, you know, I'd get a plan from the exhibition planners and just start making sketches and drawings about how I wanted the light and colour to behave in the space. And then for the tide, it really did start on a blank piece of paper, and it was this drawing which just uses felt tips that meet, and then that kind of evolved to this one where they physically meet. And I remember then thinking, well, how do I translate this drawing into something that can be expanded digitally on such an epic scale? And this was kind of the worksheets that were spat out from Simon's.
And the pattern never repeats, does it?
No, never. And that's why I think, you know, it was important to do it randomly rather than do it by hand. I can imagine how long it would have taken. We'd have still been doing it now. But yeah, I've just got little notations like move to the right and too much space and close this gap. And
yeah.
So actually 100 meters of it was generated.
Brilliant.
Get 700 meters that we wanted.
So we wanted to, of course, Magda's uploading links to all of your fantastic work. We wanted to talk about some of the events, and we had a discussion about how, what you wanted to happen in terms of the response to the piece. And so you are going to be collaborating with Kitty Joseph, and I feel that your practices kind of overlap quite a bit, because you explore color in a very similar way, and you use very similar kind of color palettes. So we're really excited that we're having an inclusive fashion event in collaboration with Kitty, and actually it'd be showcasing her archive. But you really wanted the responses. I know we're doing a choreographed piece as well. Both events to kind of reflect an idea of community. And so that came from, you told us a little bit about your inspiration, True Stories, the movie. I thought it was quite interesting to share that.
Yeah, so when I was a little girl, I was brought up with, as I've mentioned, my dad being a record collector, so really diverse music tastes, and Talking Heads were one of the favourites. And in 1984, the year before I was born, True Stories, or 1986, or the year after, True Stories was made, which we had on VHS and watched a lot. And I didn't understand the story then, but the aesthetics of the film are really interesting. I would recommend it to anyone. There's this one particular scene, and the whole film is like punctuated with Talking Head songs, but this one scene where there's a fashion show at the local mall, and there's these absolutely wonderful, wacky costumes that are brought out. And I just remember watching this, I think as a 5-year-old, thinking, wow, I'd never seen anything like this before. I'd never seen a couple wearing AstroTurf suits before. And I just thought, when you asked me what could we do to activate the work on the tide, and having visited, I just thought, well, it's a catwalk, and having the colours are so intense, and how they change and move during the day. It would just be really lovely to have that as a parade. And so, yeah, I knew Kitty's work. I've loved Kitty's work for a long time, and I often say, if Kitty was an artist, she'd make my work, and if I was a textile and fashion designer, I'd make hers.
Yeah, so it's going to be a milestone for her, I think. Magda, can you help me out? Is it 10 years of her collection? Is it an anniversary? Magda's not. Anyway, it's a milestone for Kitty's collection and practice. And the catwalk will feature a series of, hopefully a very inclusive cast, which is what we're hoping to reach out to residents of the peninsula to get involved. And what's lovely about her work is that the clothing suits quite a kind of variety of body shapes.
I mean, you look at that shirt on me and Kitty, and some of her dresses that she's got, the big gowns, I've seen Andy Oliver wear them, I've seen Kylie Minogue wear them. So, she's even got photographs on her Instagram of men wearing them. So yeah, really inclusive. And I think that goes back to the ideas of colour being a universal language.
Absolutely. So that will be taking place on the 29th of May. We will be releasing the booking information within the next week or so. And then there's going to be a piece as well by Laura Amy White, which is a choreographed piece. And I think she's already responded to other works that you've produced. And so she was delighted to kind of create a piece for us here. And that will be on the 30th of May. So the weekend of the 29th and 30th, we have 2 fantastic events responding to the work.
I can't wait. I'm so excited. And obviously, I'm good friends with both of them, and we're kind of constantly in communication about the event and what it's going to be, and expectations, and just, I think my work really lends itself to dance and movement and choreography. So I've always wanted to work with a choreographer in connection with my practice. And this seemed like a really great opportunity to do that. And she'd made a film in response to our Spectral Vision, which we saw earlier when it was on display at the Civic in Barnsley as part of my solo show there. So She did that voluntarily. She showed me the film. I thought it was amazing, and then suggested she do something on the tide. So I'm super glad that she said yes.
Thank you, Liz. This has been so great to kind of go through, you know, all these fantastic works, and, you know, we can't wait to see where your practice kind of goes from here. And we're delighted with hundreds and thousands. We're going to hand over to India, hopefully with some questions from the audience.
Hi, yeah, we've got lots of questions.
Oh, wow.
So there's one from Carlos that says, how did the colours and shapes at the tide intertwine in your thoughts to become hundreds and thousands, which he says looks amazing and he can't wait to see it?
Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, big question. I mean, there's two parts to that. One, in my mind, like Kaia said, it was a ribbon of undulating colour, and so it was really important to think of a pattern and a series of geometry that fit together, that would lend itself to the space. So circles wouldn't have worked. It was definitely about borrowing elements of the nearby architecture, which felt very linear, very straight, quite narrow, in the hope to make a work that really felt like it belonged, that it fit with the space. And then the title always comes afterwards. So hundreds and thousands, the idea that it's literally hundreds and thousands of colours, but also is kind of reminiscent of that pure joy and sensibility of walking into a sweet shop as a child, and you can smell the sweets and there's all the colours, and it's this complete cacophony of colours that is emblazoned on the tide. So hundreds and thousands. It was nearly zig a zig.
Amazing. So we've got another question that says, you document your work as sculpture. What role do the audience play in your work? Do you see your work as sculptural or as more of an installation experience?
Both. I mean, I studied sculpture. My dad was a sculptor. I am a sculptor. I sculpt light. I just use colour and light as my media rather than clay or bronze or other things. Yeah, I just enjoy my mediums. Of course, when I make a new piece, I have this checklist in my mind, which I want to adhere to every time. And it being immersive is one of them. So I see them as the same thing, really. I know some people don't.
No, definitely. So another one, how did you learn the technical elements behind lighting?
YouTube. So when I went into lighting in my final year at Glasgow, I went on YouTube, which had only just been born. So YouTube was 2006 and this was 2007. It was primitive. And I remember like typing in how to wire up a fluorescent tube, and I remember getting on this train, really, like, I call them bone shaker trains, to an area just outside Glasgow, to this lighting shop, and going in and asking for these very particular lamps, and these kind of really surly gentlemen in there looking at me. It's like, how do you know about this? Yeah, and just really learning it myself. And then since I've been making more and more work, I've really enjoyed being part of the lighting design and architecture communities. And when I need to find out information, I will tap into that and I will ask the question. But you know, I don't have as much technical know-how about the functions and the way lights, like the actual Lumieres work. I know the effects I want to create, and I know how I want it to impact on the space, but sometimes I need to ask for help of how to achieve that.
Great. So there's another one from Alicia who says, do you think appreciating the Spice Girl costumes inspired you to create work that was fundamentally based on colour, considering how colourful the Spice Girls were in terms of fashion?
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, if you think about that aesthetic, about them being highly coloured, sequined, you know, glittered, that was just a complete appeal to me as a child. And I definitely think there's kind of threads that run through. And if you think about any artist, the work they make is self-portrait. And my work is no different to that. So it's all in there. All this kind of information that we've talked about tonight kind of gets kind of put into the blender, mixed up and spat out. And what you see is what you get.
Jemima says, how refreshing to see your journey in such an honest, self-reflective way. You work in so many different places. What would your ideal space to produce a large scale work?
I get asked that a lot. I'm not going to lie, I'd like a stab at the turbine hall. I think it's such a vast, daunting space that is both interesting in terms of its heritage and form and scale, and its pedigree as well. But having said that, you know, I was asked to remake Our Colour Reflection in a massive ex-power station in East Berlin. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't go and install that because I was breastfeeding a 3-month-old baby at the time, and I just couldn't get on a plane at that point. I was knackered. But my husband and my friend Len went out and installed it, and I think, you know, it was probably as epic as the turbine hall. I love spaces like that. I just love different spaces. I think I don't want to be pigeonholed. I mean, I enjoy a white cube, but it does a completely different thing, and diverse.
So we're really interested to talk about additive colour using acrylic. Who do you work with to figure out the practicalities of making? Do you translate the mental images into reality yourself, or do you have a workshop that does the mechanics?
Yes, I have no rendering skills whatsoever. And sometimes that can be really prohibitive and annoying, because sometimes to try and communicate what's in my mind to a number of different people you just have to be a really good communicator and articulate. And sometimes, you know, my very sketchy drawings do get those messages across. But yeah, I mean, I do sit down with the guys in the workshop and we look at my sketches, we chat, we have daily phone calls about what I want. And sometimes they have to rein me back and go, that's not possible. You can't do that. That's not going to be in budget. That's not going to be safe. The structural engineer is going to say no to that. So sometimes I have to really think about materials and how they behave, whether it's kind of indoor or outdoor or temporary or permanent, because all of those things, you have different considerations. But, you know, I'm a dreamer. And I think big. I'm always encouraged to think big. And then it's how do we make it as close to my initial thought as possible without compromising too much.
And so I think we have time for one more question from Megan Day. She says, as a kid, you were particular about the order of your felt tips. Did you like to experiment with, or were you not bothered about their order? Possibly a strange question, but one of your astonishingly satisfying work prompts.
Yeah, you come on, you know the answer to that question, of course. Everything, without being OCD, was in colour order. I mean, my felt tips, my M&Ms were separated into their different colours. My nail varnish was ordered on my windowsill in the colour order. Except my clothes or my books. I'm not one of those people who has the books in the colour order. It's all alphabetical. As you can see.
Yeah, do we have any more questions or?
No, I think that's everything.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for all your questions. We just wanted to actually let everybody know that actually we are really looking forward to opening up the gallery again. And I believe we're opening up on the 17th of May. So please do keep abreast of our Now Gallery website for details, but we're looking forward to opening up the space. And Liz, thank you so much. You know, it's been delightful to work with you on this particular piece. And of course, there's lots more to come with the events. So thank you so much.
Well, likewise, it's been an absolute joy, literally, from start to finish. And yeah, I'm just really enjoying seeing everybody's images and videos coming. It's genuinely keeping me going.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.